The Babes in the Wood ballad was a very popular children's story in the Victorian era and before this, though it is not reprinted much nowadays. It is such a sad story I am surprised children liked it so much. But was it a true story? Certain evidence would suggest yes. Here is an excerpt from The Ballad of the Babes in the Wood and All About Them by Charles Kent. All English people, especially English boys and girls, love the old story of the children in the wood. It has been the darling song of the country folk ever since it was first published in 1595, so Addison tells us. The dreadful tragedy took place in the county of Norfolk, about 30 miles from Sandringham, the country home of our beloved King and Queen, in the southwest of that county. But before we take our young reader to the very spot, which tradition has pointed out as the scene of the story, we must first think of the days when those unfortunate children lived. The evidence seems to point to the reign of Queen Elizabeth, sometimes called Good Queen Bess, a reign especially celebrated for the rise of England's sea power, with her great sea captains Drake, Hawkins, Howard, Raleigh and Frobisher, who enriched the country with wealthy prizes captured from the Spanish. It was also an age of great discoveries in the New World, and of a great advance of those things which make for culture and refinement, so much so that the reign of Queen Elizabeth has ever been looked back upon the most glorious era of England's history. Why do we believe the Babes in the Wood lived in the reign of Queen Elizabeth? Well, there are several reasons for thinking so. The first reason is, we have proof that the story was first published at Norwich by a bookseller and publisher called Thomas Millington in the year 1595, that is, in the later part of her reign, about 8 years before the Queen's death. Also, if you read the commencement of the story, the writer says that the events recorded happened of late in Norfolk, that is to say, quite recently. The second reason is to be found in the little girl's Christian name, Jane. To us in these days, Jane is quite a common Christian name, and there is nothing to be learnt from it. But of the time I am speaking, the name was a new name, and quite recently introduced into England. The usual form of this name in England was Joan. We never hear of Jane until Tudor times. It came into use probably from Jane Seymour, the wife of Henry VIII, and the unfortunate Lady Jane Grey, just as Victoria became a favourite Christian name, owing to our beloved Queen Victoria. It became fashionable to have girl children with this French form of Joan, baptised Jane, by the great people in the land. Then the country gentlemen had their girls christened Jane, so down through the other classes, for we always copy one another, even down to our dress nowadays. In the pedigree of a county family who owned the estate upon which the wicked uncle's house and the wood stand, we find the name began for the first time to be used in 1548, that is to say, exactly 47 years before the story first appeared in print. And we have more proof of this story, which will appeal to those who have learnt history. And in the voyage of Portugal, 2 of his sons did die. Now every boy and girl who knows something of our English history will remember that it was in Queen Elizabeth's reign that our soldiers were frequently making what was called the Portugal voyage. Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, then became a great centre of attraction to our gallant sea captains and to the adventurous sons of England. The Portuguese were then great sailors and had made worldwide conquests. We were great friends and allies with the Portuguese, while the Spaniards were our deadly foes. So English expeditions used to set sail to Portugal, stay at Lisbon, and then set forth on voyages of discovery around the world, with the hope of meeting the Spaniards and seizing their rich prize ships. There are several allusions to this voyage in Norfolk history in Elizabeth's reign. The celebrated Norwich musicians, at the request of Sir Francis Drake, went with him on the voyage to Portugal. Also, in 1586, a gentleman of Suffolk, Mr. Thomas Cavendish, went on a voyage of adventure round the world. He had lost all his estate and fortune, so he fitted out 3 vessels as privateers, persuaded a number of young men from Norfolk and Suffolk to join him, saying that they would capture so much wealth and prizes from the Spanish that they would all return home rich men. Well, the 3 ships sailed from Plymouth to Portugal first of all. Then after a short stay at Lisbon, they set off to the South Seas and round the world. They captured a rich prize ship off California, and other prizes, arriving safely with them at Plymouth on September the 9th, 1588. Perhaps this was the voyage on which the wicked uncle's sons did die. You will now see how everything seems to tell that the story happened in the reign of Good Queen Bess, Queen Elizabeth I. Now let me explain the story to you. Afterwards you can read it for yourselves. In the county of Norfolk there lived a wealthy landowner, that is to say a gentleman with a large estate and a good deal of money besides, richer than most men of his position. He fell sick and was about to die, and most unfortunately his wife was taken ill also, and was now lying by his side at death's door. All their thoughts now were for their children, who would be left fatherless and motherless. It was a terrible thought for their dying hours, the leaving of these two beloved children, just at the time when they needed all their love and care. The father makes his will, amply providing for the children, and commits them to the care of their uncle, his brother. If the children should die before coming of age, then their uncle would inherit their wealth. It is with some misgiving the father commits the children to the uncle's care, and his last words are, as it were, a warning. If you do keep them carefully, then God will you reward. If otherwise you seem to deal, God will your deeds regard. The uncle promises the mother faithfully to carry out his trust, and uses even severe words on a failure to cherish and tend the children carefully. For he says, "The keeping of your children dear, sweet sister, do not fear. God never prosper me nor mine, nor naught else that I have, if I do wrong your children dear, when you are laid in grave." After such good intentions and promises, we wonder how he could have acted so cruelly. It was the horrible greed for money. His sacred promises, his position as uncle and guardian to the children, seemed as naught in the face of his desire to become possessed of their wealth. After the death of their parents, the uncle takes his little nephew and niece to his own home, and at first makes much of them and treats them kindly. In southwest Norfolk, 1.5 miles from Wotton town, the wicked uncle's house is still to be seen. From time immemorial it has borne the name of the House of the Wicked Uncle. Formerly it was an old manor house called Griston Old Hall, but now it is used as a farmhouse. You would like to hear something about the House of the Wicked Uncle, so I will describe it to you. It is an old house of red brick, with a trellis pattern of black brick over its walls, such as was not unusual in the reign of Henry VII. The present house appears to have been restored in the year 1597, that is, exactly 2 years after the story was written and published. Perhaps the people who owned it were rather ashamed of the tragedy, and thought they would alter the house a little, and make it look like a new house. At any rate, over the porch there is a tablet showing the date when it was restored. This is the inscription: "God save the Queen, Thomas May, 1597. There is an old barn nearby, which, judging by the brickwork, must be as old as the house, one of the uncle's barns which was not burned down." Of course, the house now has been altered and modernised, but we can tell exactly what it was like when the wicked uncle took the two children to their new home. The entrance hall of the house was in the lower end of the principal hall, which is now turned into 2 rooms. This hall had 2 very large windows, taking up very nearly the whole of one side of the room. There are the brick labels of these windows still to be seen. Then there would probably be a wooden screen separating the entrance passage from the hall. Then a back or garden entrance opposite the front entrance. Round the entire house there would be a moat full of water. Traces of this moat are still to be seen, but it has long since been filled up. To this old manor house the uncle brought the 2 children when their parents had been buried in the churchyard. But perhaps you will ask if there is or has been anything in the old house to show that the wicked uncle really lived there. Well, that is just the case, for after 1597, when the house was altered after the uncle died, we should expect that some notice would have been taken of the story. As long ago as the beginning of the 19th century, about 1800, we know from the farmers who lived here and farmed the land that the whole history of the poor little children and their wicked uncle was carved on a beautiful oak mantelpiece, and in another room were carved in wood representations of the babes, the uncle and the robins. And further back than the year 1800, we have proof of this, and also that nobody doubted the fact that the wicked uncle of the story lived in this old house, Griston Old Hall. And now to continue the story. The uncle made quite a fuss of the children at first, and so did their aunt. But that wicked desire to possess their money kept gnawing at the uncle's heart. Ah, what a terrible danger is money, and what cruel things men and women will do to obtain it. For a whole year, perhaps, he had been planning how to get rid of the children, and so get all their property for himself. The uncle had only kept them 12 months and a day, when he wickedly bargained with 2 ruffians to slay them in a wood. All wicked people have to tell lies to cover up their wickedness, so the uncle tells the children's aunt that he is going to send them up to London, to the care of a friend, to be educated. One morning the two bad men came and carried off the children, riding on horseback, as was the custom in those days. The children were pleased to ride a cock-horse, and prattled merrily to the two ruffians, never thinking any evil of them. Indeed, they had not a thought that their uncle, who had been so kind to them, would wish them any harm. Quite close to the wicked uncle's house is a wood called the Wayland Wood. It is called on old maps the Wailing Wood, and was always so called by the country people because they fancied they could hear the wailing of the poor little children in the wood still. Of course, it was nothing more than the sighing and moaning of the wind among the trees, but to the superstitious folk in this part of Norfolk, it was really the children's wail. You would like to know a little more about the wood? Well, years ago, the Reverend George Crabbe, who was the grandson of that celebrated English poet of the same name, who was rector of Merton and lived in the rectory adjoining this wood, in the very same house in which I am writing all about the babes, said that the wood was very dark and lonesome, and the underwood is chiefly hazel and blackberry bushes, so thick and high that children left in the wood might even then perish before finding their way out. It is much the same today, but the woodcutters come and clear parts of it by cutting down the wood for faggots to light fires with. In the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, the wood was much larger, with wild bracken and furze land stretching a long distance, so even if the children found their way out of the wood, they might have wandered a long way without being seen by anyone. In this wood was the great oak tree under which the dead bodies of the children were reputed to have been found. It was very old and gnarled, but unfortunately, in the year 1879, it was struck by lightning and splintered up. This was the storm which destroyed the celebrated church of Wells on the coast of Norfolk, so that this storm will not be easily forgotten. The old oak was in such a shattered condition that it was cleared away. More's the pity, you will say, for it had been a centre of attraction for generations of grown-up people, as well as boys and girls, who were interested in the babes in the wood. The old stump is still visible, so that the place has a mark by which to identify so sacred a spot. People came from far and near to obtain a fragment of the old tree, even a chip selling for a good price. Indeed, this Wayland Wood has always seemed semi-sacred in the eyes of the country folk. When the railway line from Thetford to Swaffham was being made, the great delight of the rough navvies from the shires was to obtain leave to cut a stick out of the wood to take back to their children. A stick out of the very wood where the immortal babes died was, indeed, quite a prize to take home with them. Into this Wayland Wood the two ruffians rode, with the children riding cock-horse in front. When they had arrived in the middle of this dark, lonely wood, they got off their horses, and the two wicked men began to quarrel. One, very hard of heart, wanted to kill the children at once, because he had been paid a large sum to do so. Truly, the love of money is the root of all evil. But the other man was of a much milder and kinder disposition, and the pretty innocent prattling of the children had touched his heart. This man repented, and could not find it in his heart to do so cruel a deed. So the two men began to quarrel, and as with all bad people quarrelling, it led to fighting. And all the time the poor little children were quaking with fright. Fancy the two children watching this fight, which meant to them life or death. If the fierce, hard-hearted man won the fight, then they would be killed at once. But if the tender-hearted man proved the conqueror, then their lives would be spared. No wonder they quaked with fear. But the kind man won the fight, and killed him who wanted to be the babe's murderer. How thankful those two children must have been when their friend and deliverer took them by the hand and led them away from that tragic scene, and bade them dry their tears and cry no more. And so, having dried their tears, the poor children were led on and on through this dark, lonely wood until they became so tired and weary for want of food that they could really walk no further. "Stay here," said their kindly rescuer, "and I'll go and bring ye bread." There a while the children waited and rested, but the dark shadows began to fall, and the man did not return with the food as he had promised. Then they became frightened and began to wander about, hoping they might meet the man returning from the town. The Wayland Wood is full of blackberry bushes and nut trees, so here and there they stopped to gather blackberries to satisfy their hunger. The nuts were out of reach. Darker and darker the shadows grew until, at last, the night came, and then they sat down and cried piteously. Poor little children, how sad their cruel fate! Can we not imagine how they wandered about crying for help, and were answered only by the intense silence of the wood, with now and then the hooting of an owl? At last, utterly worn out, They lay down under the great oak tree clasped in each other's arms, and there they lay, too weak to move, until their spirits left their poor, exhausted little bodies for a happier land. In a shroud of leaves, the robins, out of pity, came and covered the children's bodies, performing thus the only funeral rites. There is nothing prettier in our English ballads than this funeral by the robin redbreasts of the Wayland Wood. And now, no Norfolk boy will rob a robin redbreast's nest. It is sacred in his eyes because of their kindness to the poor dead babes in the wood. It is said that if some wicked boy forgets the story and takes the eggs from a robin's nest, that he will break his arm, or else some other punishment will overtake him. And now the ballad goes on to tell us what happened to the wicked uncle. It shows us that God does punish people in this world for their crimes. First it was his conscience, that still small voice within us, which rebukes us for our sins and wickedness. Some call it the voice of God, others the voice of our guardian angel. But there within us is this warning voice that convicts us when we do wrong. So with the cruel uncle. His conscience smote him and made his life after the wicked deed utterly miserable. Then the anger of his neighbours fell upon him. Norfolk folk are suspicious to this day, but when the country folk found that the children did not return, and that the uncle was spending their money and living extravagantly, they became convinced that he had made away with the children. In righteous anger they set fire to his barns and destroyed his growing crops, while his cattle mysteriously died. Nothing prospered with him, for God's wrath was outpoured upon him. The heaviest blow was yet to come. 2 of his sons died on the voyage to Portugal. Perhaps these young men had become disgusted with their father, and suspecting him of the cruel deed, determined to seek their fortune in a career of adventure on the high seas, and so set out on the privateering expedition. But alas, they died before reaching even Portugal. Perhaps they were happy in not living to see the completion of their father's shame and downfall. They were spared that sorrow. The voice of conscience in the wicked uncle would not be silenced. Wicked people strive to drown or strangle this warning voice, some in the dreadful vice of drink, some in extravagant and wild living, others in giving themselves up to all kinds of riotous living. I think that is exactly what the wicked uncle did. To drown the remorse within him produced by the voice of conscience, he plunged into all kinds of riotous living, such as drink, gambling, and a gay life. He soon had to mortgage his land, that is to say, raise money on it, and when he could raise no more, then he began to pawn his furniture. In the meanwhile, the man who left the children to die in the wood on the pretence that he was going to fetch them food was taken up for committing a robbery and was put in prison. Robbery was a very serious crime in those days, punishable with death. While lying in prison, this man also felt the voice of conscience rebuking him. He was smitten with remorse for so cruelly leaving those children to die of exhaustion in the wood. Remorse for his wickedness led him to repent of it, and finally he made a full confession. It is said, murder will out. So in this case, the fate of the poor children was made public. Then the story was written. The wicked uncle is already in prison for debt when the story gets about, and he dies before he can even be put on trial for his great crime. God was his judge, not man. Instead of happiness from his ill-gotten wealth, he reaped nothing but misery, and died, regretted by none, in a debtor's prison. Verily there is a God that judgeth the world, and the moral is this: when fatherless and motherless children are given into our care, they are a sacred charge entrusted to us by God himself. If we fail in the charge of them, then God's anger falls upon us, because we have willfully neglected to carry out God's plan for them. True religion before God our Father is to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep ourselves unspotted from the world. This is the story. Now you may hear the old ballad for yourselves, a copy of which is in the British Museum of London, written in old black letters, with a curious illustration of the 2 ruffians fighting in the wood. Now ponder well, you parents dear, these words which I shall write. A doleful story you shall hear, in time brought forth to light. A gentleman of good account in Norfolk dwelt of late, who did in honour far surmount most men of his estate. Sore sick he was, and like to die, no help his life could save. His wife by him as sick did lie, and both possessed one grave. No love between these 2 was lost, each was to other kind. In love they lived, in love they died, and left 2 babes behind. The one a fine and pretty boy, not passing 3 years old, the other a girl more young than he, and framed in beauty's mould. The father left his little son, as plainly doth appear, when he to perfect age should come, £300 a year, and to his little daughter Jane £500 in gold, to be paid down on marriage day, which might not be controlled. But if the children chanced to die ere they to age should come, their uncle should possess their wealth, for so the will did run. Now, brother, said the dying man, look to my children dear, be good unto my boy and girl, no friends else have they here. To God and you I do commend my children dear this day, but little while be sure we have within this world to stay. You must be father and mother both, and uncle all in one. God knows what will become of them when I am dead and gone. With that bespake their mother dear, O brother kind, quoth she, you are the man must bring our babes to wealth or misery. And if you keep them carefully, then God will you reward. But if you otherwise should deal, God will your deeds regard. With lips as cold as any stone, they kissed the children small. God bless you both, my children dear. With that the tears did fall. These speeches then their brother spake to this sick couple there. The keeping of your little ones, sweet sister, do not fear. God never prosper me, nor mine, nor aught else that I have, if I do wrong your children dear, when you are laid in grave. The parents being dead and gone, the children home he takes, and brings them straight unto his house, where much of them he makes. He had not kept these pretty babes a 12-month and a day, but for their wealth he did devise to make them both away. He bargained with 2 ruffians strong, which were of furious mood, that they should take the children young, and slay them in a wood. He told his wife an artful tale, he would the children send, to be brought up in fair London, with one that was his friend. Away then went the pretty babes, rejoicing at that tide, rejoicing with a merry mind, they should on cock-horse ride. They prate and prattle pleasantly, as they rode on the way, to those that should their butchers be, and work their lives decay. So that the pretty speech they had made murderer's heart relent, and they that undertook the deed full sore now did repent. Yet one of them, more hard of heart, did vow to do his charge, because the wretch that hired him had paid him very large. The other would not agree thereto, so here they fell to strife, with one another they did fight about the children's life. And he that was of mildest mood did slay the other there, within an unfrequented wood, where babes did quake for fear. He took the children by the hand, while tears stood in their eye, and bade them come and go with him, and look, they did not cry. And 2 long miles he led them on, while they for food complain. Stay here, quoth he, I'll bring ye bread, when I come back again. These pretty babes with hand in hand went wandering up and down, but never more they saw the man approaching from the town. Their pretty lips with blackberries were all besmeared and dyed, and when they saw the darksome night they sat them down and cried. Thus wandered these 2 pretty babes till death did end their grief. In one another's arms they died, as babes wanting relief. No burial these pretty babes of any man receives, till Robin Redbreast painfully did cover them with leaves. And now the heavy wrath of God upon their uncle fell. Yea, fearful fiends did haunt his house, his conscience felt an hell. His barns were fired, his goods consumed, his lands were barren made. His cattle died within the field, and nothing with him stayed. And in the voyage of Portugal 2 of his sons did die, and to conclude himself was brought unto much misery. He pawned and mortgaged all his land, ere 7 years came about, and now at length this wicked act did by this means come out. The fellow that did take in hand these children for to kill was for a robbery judged to die, as was God's blessed will, who did confess the very truth, the which is here expressed. Their uncle died while he for debt did long in prison rest. All you that be executors and overseers eke, of children that be fatherless and infants mild and meek, take you example by this thing, and yield to each his right, lest God with such like misery your wicked minds requite.